think of Canada, I think of a peacekeeper. I think of a global resource provider. I think of a nation that is known abroad for its great healthcare. I think of a nation that, rightly or wrongly, is also known abroad for our beavers, igloos, and mounties. But what's more, I think of a nation forged through immigration. Outside opposition, we do not deny the effect immigrants have had and continue to have on Canada and the world. But here's the thing. Times have changed. If we do not act now to defend ourselves, there may be no more place for immigrants to go. And this is something we cannot accept. So ladies and gentlemen, today I'm here to outline why in fact this resolution, this House supports for immigration, is false and should fall. But prior to doing so, I'd first like to examine this definition that was handed to us by side proposition. That being that the House is the world. Now, we disagree with this resolution, or this, not resolution, but this definition, because the world supporting for immigration is simply not possible. It's not pragmatic. America will never support a policy for immigration, as opposed to other nations that might. There are just simply too many diverse aspects around the world for us to simply lump them all into one pot and say we should allow free immigration. But that said, while we disagree with this topic and will focus our case on Canada, we will play ball with these definitions. Now, before I begin my constructive speech and present our counter model, I'd first like to examine some of the points that brought up by side proposition today. Firstly, we talked about the benefits to the developed nations. Now, they talked about several misconceptions about free immigration and how actually, if we have more workers come, more jobs are created simply because there's need and we need more workers. Well, if that's the case, there's need now in Canada. The unemployment rate is 7.7%. If we look at a European Union nation, let's look at Spain for example, 1 in 4 are actually unemployed. And there's a need for it, but jobs are not being created. So if we irresponsibly allow free immigration and simply open our borders, we now have more and more people coming to a country, no thank you sir, ultimately resulting in us not paying attention to this and having a surplus of workers. The job markets in many of these countries, especially in the Eurozone, are saturated. Immigration is not needed. Yes, sir.
So if you think that having too many people is possible, why then don't we have massive unemployment because of women joining the workforce?
Sir, that was in a time when men went off to war. There was a need for workers. There was a net need for workers. Men were going off to fight the war in World War I, and as a result, society responded by finding these workers to put in. There is not that need now, so that point simply does not stand. What's more, they talked about this fact about the benefit to the developing nations and how we have this concept of wage conversion, there's more training, and there's aid. Now my partner Chris will talk about the wage conversion point and the aid in more depth, but I'd like to focus on this training point right now. They brought this fact that some workers leave their country, go to another country, learn their skill, come back to the country, and benefit the developing nation. What they fail to tell you is what happens to that nation where they were educated. They came to that country, used its services, used its infrastructure, used its societal benefits, but did nothing to pay back. They went back to their country. Consider the following. 80% of Kenyan doctors were in fact trained outside of Kenya, but returned to Kenya. They trained in another country, but had no vested interest in that country. And this is something we cannot support on this side of the House, sure.
Wouldn't you agree that most of the world thinks that helping out Kenya is actually a good thing?
Certainly, sir. This example is merely to show how if people come out of country without no vested interest in the country, this shows that immigration is in fact not sustainable for the developed nation. So while you might be giving a net benefit to the developing nation, you ultimately not address the issue as a whole. My partner and I have a counter model and 3 pillars. Our counter model is quite simple. We would like to modify the point system. Now, since this is the final round today, I'm sure many of you are familiar with what the point system is, but I'm just going to outline it briefly just to make sure we're on the same page. The point system is the current system in Canada. We'd like to see this, if it is truly the world's our house, imposed upon many nations, or employed in many nations. What the point system does is actually allocates points based on several factors that immigrants need in order to integrate into a country, specifically like Canada. So things like age, family, flexibility, education, work experience are all employed and modified, and you're given points in turn. If you have enough points, you are in. So we'd like to further promote immigration of young immigrant workers to these countries because they are the ones these countries need to move forward. So we give more points to them, specifically in Canada. Additionally, we would give priority to those with a job by giving them more points. And we'd also include a clause in many of these nations to ensure that abuse of any refugee statuses is not occurring. No, thank you, sir. So now my first pillar. I have the first two pillars. My partner Chris will discuss the third. The first pillar is consequences. The second is organization. And the third and final is international issues. Before I begin my speech, there is one fact I think needs to be made evidently clear to the House today. When the European Union started its policy of free immigration, it was suspected that 30,000 people would flock into urban centers. What ended up happening was that 150,000 workers ended up flocking to urban centers, overwhelming their infrastructure and social services. So now, if we look at a nation like Canada, or even in the EU, if they would like to go that route, we see that existing challenges in these countries could be exacerbated by free immigration. The infrastructure strains we can observe, the wages will go down. And while this might be a good thing for business for a time, we actually see that we become a bit subservient to business. Because if we need a job and our wages are low, we are constantly grappling with business to hold on to that position. What's more, inherently, class sizes go up. Lineups in hospitals that are already long in many of these countries go up. Public transportation is strained. And affordable housing, which is an issue for many nations, including Canada, no thank you, sir, are things that will continue to be strained if we allow an unrestricted policy of free immigration. Now, many people believe that immigration can help solve some of the employment, or not employment, but rather underpopulation issues of many countries. Now, specifically Canada is one I'd like to focus on here. Many people believe this is the case, these immigrants who come in can in fact help Canada. But the reality is that, how many times have you gone abroad, someone's asked where you're from, you say Calgary, and they ask is that near Toronto? The reality is that people are looking for these few gateways that people are looking for because there's an established immigrant population there. If this hasn't convinced you, consider in Canada that in 2007, immigrants drew $6,000 more in net benefits than they paid into the system, making our social services, if they were sustainable now, unsustainable then. What's more, even if things go well, as Proposition Pound believes, we have unrestricted job creation, then we risk superheating our economy, having a bust in our economy, and as a result, we end up being on the hook for all these workers who have no job for protected time certain. Additionally, I'd like to bring up this one fact: employment. In Canada in 2006, immigrant workers were 2 times more likely to be unemployed than a Canadian-born one, and skilled workers, who we supposedly need, were 4 times more likely to be unemployed. My next point is organization. I'd like to touch on this very, very quickly. Firstly, we believe the point system stands on an appropriate basis for us to integrate and nurture people in difficult transition. Immigrants already cite that some of the most difficult things about coming to a new country like Canada, or many of the European Union nations which are similar to Canada, is that they have a hard time meeting the experience requirements, the education requirements, having appropriate finances in place, and having work experience. Point systems assess this, and as a result, they allow us to integrate them into society. Why would we remove such barriers to immigration that allow us to integrate people better? It simply doesn't make sense, ladies and gentlemen. So for the reasons I have just described to you, namely the consequences of open immigration in countries like Canada and the European Union nations, and the lack of organization that would ensue from removing barriers to immigration, we have cited proposition to believe this resolution, or rather opposition, must believe this resolution must most definitely fall. Thank you.